My name is Julian Vance, I'm 42, and for 15 years, I lived a lie, convinced my quiet wife Eleanor was too blind to see my brilliant double life. But at the Seattle Architectural Gala, my mistress Clara made a reckless move, pulling me into a dark gallery. That single, passionate encounter triggered an irreversible trap. How did my empire vanish? A sudden chorus of phone chimes, a viral, high-definition video of our betrayal sent to my entire network, and the sickening silence of 100 judging eyes. In just 72 hours, my entire existence was systematically demolished. And the keeper of my secrets? Eleanor, who stood before me adjusting my silk bow tie with gentle, ordinary fingers, her face so warm and untroubled that I never once suspected my impending exposure. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. The evening began with the gentle, rhythmic hum of Eleanor's sewing machine in the sunlit parlor of their Bellevue home. Julian Vance stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his dressing room, admiring the flawless drape of his custom-tailored tuxedo. The house smelled of lavender polish and freshly cut lilies, a testament to Eleanor's quiet, meticulous care. She stepped into the room, her smile warm and untroubled, and reached up to adjust his silk bow tie with practiced, gentle fingers. "You look magnificent, Julian," she murmured, her eyes reflecting nothing but pure, trusting devotion. Julian smiled down at her, feeling a familiar, intoxicating surge of superiority. He patted her hand, utterly convinced of his own brilliance. He had managed the perfect life, a devoted, quiet wife to anchor his social status, and Clara, the fiery, exquisite wife of his primary investor, to satisfy his deeper, darker cravings. Eleanor had no idea, and she never would. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of patronizing affection, and they departed for the annual Seattle Architectural Gala, the crowning event of his career. The grand ballroom of the Olympic Hotel was a dazzling sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the low, sophisticated murmur of the city's elite. Julian walked through the crowd with Eleanor on his arm, basking in the respectful nods of his peers. Yet, his gaze kept drifting across the crowded room to where Clara stood beside her older, oblivious husband. She wore a backless emerald gown that clung to her curves, and when her eyes met Julian's, a jolt of pure, electric tension shot through him. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the dangerous thrill of their shared secret. For weeks, they had stolen moments in dark corners, but tonight, surrounded by hundreds of people, the urge to touch her became an unbearable, throbbing ache. When Eleanor stepped away to speak with a group of board members' wives, Julian caught Clara's subtle nod. He drifted toward the grand staircase, his heart hammering against his ribs, and slipped unnoticed into the darkened, private gallery on the third floor. A moment later, the door clicked open, and Clara slipped inside, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The silence of the gallery, surrounded by towering marble sculptures, only amplified the wild pounding of his heart. Without a word, Julian pulled her into the shadows behind a massive granite column. The collision of their bodies was electric, a desperate release of the suffocating pressure that had built up all evening. He pressed her against the cool, unforgiving stone, his hands sliding hungrily up the smooth silk of her gown, tracing the bare skin of her back. Clara let out a soft, breathless gasp as his lips found her neck, kissing her with a fierce, possessive hunger that bordered on madness. Their movements were frantic, fueled by the terrifying thrill of proximity to ruin. He lifted her slightly, her legs wrapping around his hips as they surrendered to the raw, urgent passion of the moment. Every touch was heightened by the knowledge that his wife and her husband were just 2 floors below. For a few suspended, breathless minutes, the world outside ceased to exist, replaced only by the heat of their skin, the frantic rhythm of their breathing, and the intoxicating danger of their betrayal. As the peak of their passion subsided, they clung to each other, shivering in the dim light of the gallery. Julian slowly let her down, his hands trembling as he helped her smooth the emerald silk of her dress. He smiled, a breathless, triumphant smirk returning to his face. They had done it again, right under everyone's noses. He adjusted his bow tie, feeling invincible. But before he could step back into the hallway, a sudden, synchronized chorus of chimes and vibration alerts echoed from the ballroom below, a bizarre, collective digital swell that drifted up the stairwell. Julian frowned, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. A new message notification blinked on his screen, sent from an anonymous address to every contact in his professional network, including his clients, his partners, and his wife. He tapped the file, his blood turning to ice. A crystal-clear, high-definition video began to play, showing him and Clara in the absolute throes of their passion against the very marble column where they stood. Below the video, a single line of text read, "A masterclass in modern exposure." From the ballroom below, the low murmur of polite conversation died, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence, followed by the rising whisper of 100 shocked voices. Julian looked at Clara, whose face had drained of all color, and realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that the trap had just snapped shut. The silence that rushed into the gallery was heavier than any sound Julian had ever heard. Clara let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at her phone screen, where the loop of their intimate encounter played on a relentless, devastating repeat. Julian tried to touch her arm, to offer some semblance of reassurance, but she flinched away from him as if his skin were made of fire. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and pure venom. "You did this. You promised it was safe." Before he could utter a single word of defense, she turned and fled down the dimly lit corridor of the third floor, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood, leaving him utterly alone among the cold, silent marble statues. Julian stood frozen, his own phone vibrating repeatedly in his palm as messages, alerts, and calls began to flood his screen in a relentless, mocking tide. He forced his legs to move, dragging himself toward the heavy glass double doors that overlooked the grand ballroom. When he looked down, the sight made his stomach violently contract. The sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits had shifted into small, tight clusters of people, all huddled over their glowing screens. Necks craned upward toward the gallery. The polite, symphonic murmur of the gala had been replaced by a low, buzzing hiss of condemnation. He saw his principal business partners, men who had toasted his genius just an hour prior, shaking their heads in disgust. He searched the crowd desperately for Eleanor, hoping against hope to see her face, to find some anchor in the chaos. But her chair at the head table was empty, her black evening bag gone. She had vanished into the Seattle night, leaving him to face the wolves alone. Descending the grand staircase felt like walking to a public execution. Every eye in the room locked onto him, heavy with judgment, mockery, and cold satisfaction. No one spoke to him. As he crossed the marble lobby, people actively stepped aside, clearing a path of shame as if he carried a contagious plague. He spotted Clara's husband, a powerful man whose investments funded Julian's most ambitious projects, being escorted out of the side exit by security, his face a mask of thunderous, pale rage. Julian did not stop. He ran through the revolving doors and into the cool, damp night air, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of his own exposure. He drove home at a reckless speed, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred past him in a dizzying smear of red and gold. He needed to find Eleanor. He needed to scream, to demand answers, to force her to explain how she had orchestrated this ruin. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his Bellevue home, the house was dark, silhouetted against the gray night sky like a tomb. He slammed the car door and rushed to the front entrance, his key trembling as he shoved it into the lock. The door swung open into an eerie, echoing silence. The warm scent of lavender and lilies was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile draft of an empty house. Julian threw the light switch, and his heart stopped. The grand foyer, once filled with expensive art and antique furniture, was completely bare. He ran from room to room, his footsteps echoing hollowly against the polished floorboards. The living room was stripped of its designer sofas, the dining table was gone, and even the paintings had been taken from the walls, leaving pale squares on the paint. Upstairs, in their master bedroom, the closets were open and completely empty. There was no sign of struggle, no chaos. It was a clean, methodical evacuation. On the bare kitchen counter sat a single, cream-colored envelope. Julian approached it slowly, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a copy of the power of attorney he had signed 3 years ago during their mortgage refinancing, alongside a brief, typed note. It did not contain tears or accusations. It simply stated that she had exercised her legal right to liquidate their shared assets, sell his luxury vehicles, and lease the property to a local university housing group effective the following Monday. As he stared at the paper, the reality of his complete and absolute isolation began to settle over him like a suffocating shroud. He was ruined, homeless, and entirely at her mercy, and the weekend was not yet over. The transition from Sunday morning to Monday dawn was an agonizing, slow-motion descent into purgatory. Julian spent those endless, silent hours pacing the bare hardwood floors of the empty Bellevue house, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the vacant rooms. The physical absence of his life's collected treasures, the mid-century modern furniture he had meticulously curated, the original oil paintings, the custom wool rugs, felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He tried calling his bank's emergency line dozens of times, only to be met with the same automated, metallic voice informing him that his access had been temporarily suspended due to suspicious activity reported by the primary account holder. He called his personal attorney, Marcus, but the man's phone went straight to a generic voicemail that offered no comfort. He tried calling Eleanor's sister, her friends, and even her favorite cousin, but his calls were either instantly rejected or went unanswered, leaving him to scream his frustration into the dead air. He eventually collapsed onto the hard, cold floor of the master bedroom, using his folded, wrinkled tuxedo jacket as a pathetic excuse for a pillow, staring up at the ceiling as the shadows of the passing cars outside danced across the plaster like mocking ghosts. When the alarm on his phone finally chimed at 6 o'clock on Monday morning, Julian woke with a stiff neck and a mouth that tasted of ash. The Pacific Northwest weather had synchronized perfectly with his despair. A heavy, slate-gray rain was falling, washing over the tall windows and obscuring the Bellevue skyline in a depressing, watery blur. He dragged himself to the master bathroom, only to find that Eleanor had been so thorough she had even removed the towels, leaving nothing but a single, half-empty roll of toilet paper on the brass fixture. He washed his face with freezing water, using the sleeve of his shirt to dry his skin. He dressed in the dark, pulling on the only clean suit he had left in his car's garment bag, smoothing the lapels with trembling hands. He had to go to the office. The firm, Vance and Associates, was his fortress, the monument to his genius that no domestic scandal could ever truly tear down. He was the creative engine of the company, and his partners would surely understand that a bitter, vengeful wife was simply trying to sabotage his professional standing. The drive into downtown Seattle was a blur of red brake lights and splashing puddles. Julian parked his sedan in his designated space in the underground garage, staring for a long moment at the brass plaque that read Julian Vance, senior partner. He took a deep breath, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror, trying to summon the mask of effortless arrogance that had carried him through a decade of cutthroat business deals. But the moment he stepped out of the elevator on the 12th floor of the glass and steel tower, the illusion began to shatter. The sleek, minimalist reception area was unnervingly quiet. Sarah, the receptionist who had greeted him with a warm smile every morning for the past 5 years, did not look up when he entered. She kept her eyes glued to her computer monitor, her posture rigid and uncomfortable. "Good morning, Sarah," Julian said, his voice sounding thin and hollow in the quiet space. She did not reply. She merely pressed a button on her desk phone and whispered a single, chilling sentence into her headset: "He is here." Before Julian could even reach the glass doors leading to his private office, Arthur Pendleton emerged from the main corridor. Arthur, the senior founding partner of the firm, was a man of 70 years whose sharp blue eyes and legendary ruthlessness had dominated the city's architectural landscape for decades. Arthur did not offer his hand. He simply looked at Julian with a cold, dead expression. "In the boardroom, Julian," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of any human warmth. "Now." Julian followed him down the hallway, acutely aware of the sudden, suffocating silence that fell over the open concept design floor. Colleagues and junior draftsmen who had once hung on his every word now stared at him through the glass partitions, their faces filled with a mixture of morbid curiosity and quiet satisfaction. Inside the boardroom, his other two partners, Richard and Evelyn, were already seated at the long, polished walnut table. In front of each of them lay several printed copies of the mass email from the night before, the explicit still frames from the loft video glaringly visible under the bright fluorescent lights. "Julian," Richard began, his voice dripping with clinical condescension, "we have spent the last 12 hours dealing with a public relations catastrophe of unprecedented proportions." Julian raised his hands, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "Look, I know how this looks. My wife has orchestrated a highly sophisticated smear campaign. The video is a complete violation of my privacy, and we can easily sue the source. It has nothing to do with my work here." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure disgust. "It has everything to do with your work, Julian. 2 hours ago, the City Planning Commission called to inform us that they are reviewing our bid for the waterfront revitalization project. The lead developer is a deeply conservative family trust, and they have explicitly stated they will not be associated with a firm whose senior partner is plastered across the internet in a public scandal involving the wife of one of our primary investors." Richard nodded in agreement, pushing a thick manila folder across the table toward Julian. "We have a morality clause in our partnership agreement, Julian. Section 12, Paragraph 4. Any partner who engages in conduct that brings public disrepute, scandal, or significant financial harm to the firm is subject to immediate, non-negotiable expulsion." Julian felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "You cannot do this. I built the reputation of this firm. My designs are the only reason we are even in the running for the waterfront project." Arthur stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the table. "Your designs are brilliant, Julian, but you are a liability we cannot afford. The board voted unanimously at 7 this morning. Your shares in the partnership are being liquidated at book value, minus the projected financial damages your actions have caused our current contracts. The check will be deposited into your account, assuming you still have one active. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. You have 15 minutes to pack your personal belongings." The walk back to his office was a waking nightmare. 2 burly security guards stood by his door, watching in silence as Julian frantically swept his expensive drafting pens, a few personal sketchbooks, and a framed photograph of his first award-winning building into a cardboard box. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes tracking his every movement through the glass walls. He had been a demanding, often arrogant boss, and as he walked toward the elevators with his cardboard box cradled in his arms, he realized that not a single person in the building was going to shed a tear for his demise. Sitting in his car in the dark underground garage, the cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat like a tombstone, Julian broke down. He gripped the steering wheel and let out a raw, ragged sob, his chest heaving as the reality of his professional execution fully sank in. He needed Clara. She was the only one who shared this nightmare, the only one who could understand the sheer terror of what was happening. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. To his surprise, the call connected on the third ring, but it was not Clara's voice that answered. "Mr. Vance," a cold, clinical male voice spoke, "this is Thomas Sterling, legal counsel for the Marshall family. Do not call this number again." Julian gasped, his voice cracking. "Clara, please, I just need to speak to her for 1 second. Is she all right?" "Mr. Vance, let me be exceptionally clear," the lawyer continued, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Mrs. Marshall is currently preparing a formal statement for the police and her husband's divorce attorneys. She will be alleging that you used your position as her primary architect and financial advisor to manipulate and coerce her into an unwanted sexual relationship. If you attempt to contact her, her family, or her husband in any way, we will immediately file for a permanent restraining order and pursue criminal charges of harassment." The line went dead before Julian could utter another word. He stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Clara was throwing him to the wolves, rewriting their passionate, reckless affair as a story of coercion to save her own skin and whatever financial settlement she could claw back from her husband. With nowhere else to go, Julian drove back to the empty house in Bellevue, his mind spinning in a desperate search for a logical solution. But as he turned onto his quiet, tree-lined street, his heart plummeted into his stomach. A massive yellow moving truck was parked directly in his driveway, blocking his path. Several loud, young men in college sweatshirts were carrying a battered leather sofa and a stack of plastic storage bins through his front door. Upbeat, bass-heavy music was blasting from a portable speaker sitting on the front porch, shattering the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. Julian slammed his car into park, ignoring the rain as he marched up the driveway, his face flushed with a dangerous mixture of rage and panic. "What the hell is going on here?" he yelled, his voice cracking over the sound of the music. "Who authorized you to be on this property?" A tall, muscular young man with a backward baseball cap turned to him, holding a box of kitchen supplies. "Who are you?" the kid asked, looking Julian up and down with mild amusement. "I am Julian Vance. I own this house," Julian snarled, stepping closer. "Get your things and your truck off my driveway immediately." The kid frowned, setting the box down on the hood of Julian's car. "Look, man, I don't know who you are, but we rented this place. We signed a 2-year lease on Friday afternoon. We paid the first month's rent and a hefty security deposit to Eleanor Vance. She told us her husband was leaving the country for an extended period and that we could move in first thing Monday morning. She even gave us the keys." Julian shoved past the kid, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran up the steps to the front door, pulling his key ring from his pocket. He jammed his house key into the lock, but it wouldn't budge. He twisted it frantically, throwing his shoulder against the heavy oak door, but the brass cylinder remained stubbornly, mockingly still. The lock had been replaced with a brand new, high-security deadbolt. He began to pound on the door with his fists, screaming Eleanor's name into the rain, his voice echoing hollowly off the brick facade. The college students gathered at the bottom of the steps, watching him with a mixture of confusion and growing hostility. "Hey, buddy," the leader said, stepping up the stairs to block Julian's path. "You need to calm down and get off our property right now, or we are calling the police." Before the situation could escalate further, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. A man in a dark suit and a tie stepped out into the rain, carrying a thick manila envelope. He walked up the driveway with a calm, practiced stride, his eyes scanning the tense scene before locking onto Julian's disheveled, rain-soaked figure. "Julian Vance?" the man asked. Julian turned, his chest heaving, his hands still clenched into fists. "Yes. What do you want?" The man handed him the envelope with a faint, professional nod. "You have been served," he said simply, before turning on his heel and walking back to his car, disappearing into the gray morning mist. Julian collapsed onto the bottom step of his former home, the cold rain soaking through his expensive wool suit, turning his hair into a plastered mess. He tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, his vision blurring as he pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. It was not a divorce filing, as he had desperately hoped. It was a comprehensive, ironclad legal notification prepared by a high-priced asset protection firm. Eleanor had been planning this for months, executing every step with the precision of a master architect. The documents detailed the complete liquidation of their joint investment accounts, totaling over $2 million. Every single penny had been legally transferred into a newly registered charitable organization called the Eleanor Vance Sanctuary for Women. Because Julian had signed a broad, irrevocable power of attorney 3 years ago during a complex tax restructuring deal, the transfers were entirely legal and beyond his reach. The packet also included a copy of the bill of sale for his luxury sedan, which had been sold to a wholesale dealership in Oregon for $50,000, and the formal lease agreement for the Bellevue house, which would generate $4,000 a month in rental income for Eleanor's new foundation. At the very back of the packet, printed on a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, was a personal letter from Eleanor. Julian read the elegant, typed words, his eyes burning with tears of pure, helpless rage. Julian, you always believed you were the sole architect of our lives, that I was merely a passive spectator in your grand design. You thought my silence was weakness, and that my devotion was blindness. You were wrong. I have known about Clara for 6 months. I have known about the loft, the trips, the lies, and the private parking routines. I decided that if you wished to live a life of complete independence, without my knowledge or consent, then I should grant you that wish in its entirety. I have taken the house, the cars, the money, and your precious reputation. I have left you with the one thing you valued above all else, your absolute freedom. Do not bother looking for me. I am currently on a flight to Europe, where I will be managing the international expansion of my new foundation. I will not be filing for divorce. If you wish to be free of our marriage, you will have to file for abandonment, which will require you to disclose the full, humiliating extent of your financial ruin in a public court of law. Enjoy your open relationship, Julian. I hope it is as beautiful as the buildings you used to design. Julian let the papers slip from his fingers. They fluttered down onto the wet asphalt, the black ink beginning to bleed and run in the pooling rainwater. He looked up at the young men who were now watching him with a mixture of pity and discomfort, the loud music still pulsing from the porch. He had nothing left. No job, no home, no money, no reputation, and no wife. He was a ghost in his own life, completely demolished by the brilliant, devastating design of the woman he had so foolishly dismissed as weak. The wet grass of his front lawn clung to the cuffs of his trousers as Julian Vance knelt in the mud, his fingers scraping against the cold, rain-slicked asphalt of the driveway. The legal documents Eleanor had left him were scattered, their edges curling and turning translucent under the relentless downpour. Behind him, the bass from the college student's portable speaker thudded against his skull, a rhythmic, mocking vibration that seemed to celebrate his sudden eviction. He gathered the ruined papers, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped them twice, before shoving them back into the tearing manila envelope. The young men watched him from the dry sanctuary of the porch, their expressions transitioning from confusion to a cold, suburban indifference. One of them took a slow sip from a red plastic cup, his eyes locked on Julian's ruined suit. Julian did not look back at them. He dragged himself to his sedan, throwing his cardboard box of office supplies into the passenger seat and slamming the door to shut out the music and the rain. He sat in the driver's seat, his chest heaving, his breath fogging up the windshield. He turned the key in the ignition, desperate to drive away, to find a quiet place to think, to breathe. The engine purred to life, a familiar, comforting sound of German engineering. But before he could shift the car into reverse, a massive, yellow flatbed tow truck pulled into the cul-de-sac, its amber warning lights flashing lazily through the gray mist. The truck backed up directly toward his driveway, blocking him in completely. Julian rolled down his window, the cold rain immediately spraying his face. "What do you think you are doing?" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get that truck out of my way." A burly man in a high-visibility vest stepped down from the cab, holding a digital clipboard. "Julian Vance," the man asked, his voice flat and professional. "Yes," Julian snapped. "Move your truck." "I am in a hurry." The man shook his head slowly. "I cannot do that, sir. I am here to repossess this vehicle on behalf of the Bellevue Luxury Auto Group." The lease was terminated and the vehicle's return was authorized by Eleanor Vance at 9 o'clock this morning. "The paperwork is fully executed." "I need you to step out of the car, sir." Julian stared at him, his mind refusing to process the words. "This is my car, I pay the lease," he protested. The man tapped his digital clipboard. "The lease is in the name of your architectural firm, sir, and the primary guarantor is listed as Eleanor Vance under the corporate restructuring agreement. She signed the release forms over the weekend. If you do not step out of the vehicle, I will have to call the local police department to assist with the recovery." Julian looked at the man's broad shoulders, then back at the college students who were now laughing on the porch. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing his lungs. He realized he had no fight left in him, not here, not in front of these strangers. He grabbed his cardboard box of office supplies, his ruined manila envelope, and stepped out into the pouring rain. He stood on the sidewalk, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the wet mud of the parking strip, and watched as his sedan was slowly winched onto the back of the flatbed. The amber lights flashed, casting long, sickly yellow reflections across the wet asphalt as the truck drove away, leaving him completely stranded. With the cardboard box cradled in his arms like a deceased child, Julian began to walk. The rain was relentless, soaking through his custom wool suit until it felt like a cold, wet lead weight dragging him down. He walked past the manicured lawns of his neighbors, people who had invited him to dinner parties, people who had admired his designs. He kept his head down, terrified that one of them might look out their window and see him in this pathetic state. He walked for nearly 2 miles before his legs could no longer support the weight of his exhaustion. He collapsed onto the metal bench of a transit bus shelter, his chest heaving. When the bus finally arrived, a rumbling, diesel-fumed monster, he climbed aboard, ignoring the curious and disgusted stares of the other passengers. He paid his fare with a damp $5 bill he found in his pocket, his last remaining physical cash, and rode the bus across the bridge, away from the wealthy enclave of Bellevue and toward the grimmer, industrial corridors of Seattle. He got off on Highway 99, a stretch of road known for its cheap motels, adult bookstores, and flickering neon signs. The Emerald Rest Motel was a 2-story concrete structure with peeling green paint and a sign that buzzed with a dying, high-pitched hum. Julian walked into the lobby, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner hitting him like a wall. Behind a thick pane of scratched bulletproof glass, a tired-looking clerk with dark circles under his eyes looked up from a small television screen. $75 a night, plus a $50 deposit, the clerk said, his voice entirely devoid of interest. Julian reached into his wet pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He slid his Platinum Visa card through the small opening at the bottom of the glass. The clerk swiped it. A sharp, double beep echoed through the quiet lobby. Declined, the clerk said, sliding the card back. Julian's heart skipped a beat. Try it again. It must be a mistake. The clerk swiped it again, with the same result. Try this one, Julian said, sliding his corporate American Express card. Declined. Julian felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He began to search the manila envelope, his fingers tearing at the wet paper. Deep inside a small, plastic sleeve at the back of the folder, his fingers brushed against something hard. He pulled it out. It was a sleek, black prepaid debit card. On the back, a small piece of white masking tape was stuck to the plastic. Written in Eleanor's elegant, precise handwriting were the words, $500. For your transition. Julian stared at the card, a bitter, hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. She had thought of everything. She had known he would be stranded, that his cards would be frozen, and she had left him just enough money to survive in a cheap motel for a few days, a final, patronizing act of charity. He slid the black card through the slot. The machine beeped, a single, high-pitched tone of approval. Room 112, the clerk said, sliding a plastic key card and a thin, scratchy towel across the counter. Julian took them and walked down the outdoor walkway, the rain dripping from the metal overhang onto his shoulders. He unlocked the door to room 112 and stepped inside. The room was small and damp, smelling of old carpet and industrial bleach. A single queen-sized bed with a faded floral bedspread sat in the center of the room, flanked by a laminate nightstand and a flickering fluorescent light that cast a sickly green glow over the peeling wallpaper. Julian set his cardboard box on the desk and collapsed onto the bed, his wet clothes soaking into the mattress. He lay there in the dark for hours, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Finally, he pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he searched his contacts. He needed a voice, any voice, that did not treat him like a monster. He dialed his younger brother, Thomas, a successful corporate attorney in Boston. The phone rang 4 times before Thomas answered, his voice stiff and formal. "Julian," Thomas said. "I was wondering if you would call." "Thomas, thank God," Julian gasped, sitting up on the bed. "You have to help me. Eleanor has gone completely insane. She has emptied our accounts, sold my car, leased my house, and I am sitting in a disgusting motel on Highway 99. She is trying to ruin me." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Julian could hear the faint sound of papers rustling. "Julian," Thomas said, his voice cold and flat. "Eleanor sent me the folder. She sent it to Mom, to Dad, and to everyone in the family. We saw the video, Julian. And we saw the financial statements she attached. You spent $30,000 of your joint savings on a diamond necklace for Clara last month, while telling us you could not afford to help with Mom's medical care. You lied to us, you cheated on your wife, and now you are accused of coercing a client's wife. I cannot help you. The family wants nothing to do with this. Do not call me again." The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone, his breath catching in his throat. He dialed his closest friend, David, a man he had known since their days at the University of Washington. "David, please," Julian whispered when the call connected. "I need a place to stay. Just for a few days." "Julian," David said, his voice quiet and uncomfortable. "I saw the email. Everyone in the architectural community saw it. My partners are already talking about how this is going to affect our joint ventures. I cannot have you associated with my firm right now. It is a business decision, Julian. I am sorry." The call ended with a soft click. Julian let the phone fall from his hand onto the faded floral bedspread. He was completely, utterly alone. The entire world had turned its back on him, guided by the invisible, masterfully executing hand of his quiet wife. The next morning, the rain had cleared slightly, leaving a cold, damp fog that hung over the city. Julian used a fraction of his remaining prepaid funds to purchase a cheap, generic pair of sweatpants and a hooded sweatshirt from a nearby convenience store, unable to bear the thought of wearing his ruined, mud-stained tuxedo trousers any longer. He scheduled an emergency consultation with Lawrence Croft, a high-profile asset litigation attorney whose office was located in a modest brick building in the Fremont neighborhood. Julian sat in the leather chair across from Croft, his fingers nervously tearing at the edge of his paper coffee cup as he explained the situation. He laid out the legal documents, the power of attorney, the bank transfers, and the lease agreement. "We have to sue her," Julian said, his voice rising with a desperate, frantic energy. "We have to file an emergency injunction to freeze the accounts of her foundation. She stole my money. She sold my car without my consent. This is grand larceny." Lawrence Croft adjusted his glasses, slowly flipping through the thick stack of papers. He sighed, a sound that made Julian's stomach tighten with a familiar, sickening dread. "Mr. Vance," Croft said, leaning back in his chair. "I am going to be entirely frank with you. This is one of the most meticulously prepared asset protection strategies I have ever seen. You signed a general, durable power of attorney 3 years ago. It was drafted by your own firm's corporate lawyers and signed voluntarily by you in front of a notary. It granted your wife unrestricted authority to manage, sell, transfer, or liquidate any and all assets held in your name, jointly or individually." Julian shook his head. "But that was for tax purposes, it was meant to be used if I was incapacitated," he argued. Croft pointed to a paragraph on the 3rd page. "It does not state that, Mr. Vance. It is a durable power of attorney, meaning it is active from the moment of signing and remains active until formally revoked in writing. You never revoked it. Eleanor acted completely within her legal rights when she liquidated those accounts and sold the vehicle. But the money," Julian pleaded. $2 million, she cannot just give it away to a charity she created." Croft tapped the document. "She did not give it away to herself. She transferred it to a registered, federally compliant nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of abuse. The board of directors is independent, though she is the executive director. Because the funds are now held by a registered charity, they are legally shielded from personal asset division in a standard divorce proceeding. Even if we filed for divorce today, a judge would have an incredibly difficult time clawing back those funds from a public charity, especially since they were transferred using a valid power of attorney before any divorce action was initiated. To even attempt to litigate this would require a retainer of $50,000 up front, and the legal fees would easily exceed $200,000 over the next 3 years, with a very low probability of success. You simply do not have the resources to fight this, Mr. Vance. Julian felt as though the room were spinning, the walls closing in on him. But there is more, Croft continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. I noticed that the liquidation of your partnership shares and the sale of your personal assets occurred within this fiscal year. Because Eleanor executed these transactions using your power of attorney under your name, the capital gains and income tax liabilities will be filed under your Social Security number. Since the funds were donated to a charity, Eleanor's foundation will receive a massive tax write-off, but you, as an individual, will be held personally liable for the taxes on the liquidated shares. By my estimation, you will owe the Internal Revenue Service approximately $350,000 by April 15. And since you have no assets and no income, they will place a permanent lien on any future earnings you might make. Julian stared at the lawyer, his jaw hanging open, unable to make a sound. And then there is the matter of Clara Marshall, Croft added, looking at him with a cold, professional judgment. Her husband's attorneys have already contacted our office to ensure we are not representing you in any capacity that would conflict with their upcoming civil suit. Clara is preparing to file a formal complaint alleging sexual coercion and professional misconduct. If she pursues this, your architectural license will be permanently revoked by the state board, and you could face criminal charges. My advice to you, Mr. Vance, is to keep a very low profile, find a basic job that pays in cash if possible, and do not attempt to contact Eleanor or Clara. You are in a very deep hole, and any move you make right now will only make it collapse on top of you. Julian walked out of the office, his legs feeling like lead. The fog had turned back into a cold, stinging drizzle that coated his face. He had no car, no money, and no hope. He walked down the sidewalk, the cardboard box of his former life tucked under his arm, heading back toward the dingy motel on Highway 99. He realized with a terrifying, absolute certainty that Eleanor had not just left him, she had designed a perfect, inescapable prison for him, using his own arrogance, his own signatures, and his own greed as the bricks and mortar. He was completely demolished, and the worst part was that he had helped her build the machine that did it. The last of the $500 on the black prepaid card vanished on a cold, damp Thursday morning when the front desk clerk at the Emerald Rest Motel informed Julian that his week was up. Julian stood in the cramped, drafty lobby, the collar of his cheap convenience store sweatshirt pulled tight against his neck, as the clerk pointed to the red digital screen of the card terminal. The screen flashed a single, cold word, depleted. Julian did not argue. He had spent the last several days watching the balance dwindle dollar by dollar on cheap microwave meals, transit fares, and the burner phone he had purchased to keep in touch with the few lawyers who would still take his calls. He returned to room 112 one last time, gathered his single cardboard box of office supplies, and walked out into the gray, misty morning. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with a biting, maritime chill that seemed to seep directly into his bones. He walked down the cracked asphalt of Highway 99, the cardboard box cradled against his chest like a shield, his mind spinning with a desperate, frantic calculation of his remaining options. His first stop was a dusty, narrow pawnshop squeezed between a boarded-up diner and a neon-lit tattoo parlor. The air inside the shop was warm and heavy, smelling of old brass, motor oil, and the collective desperation of 1,000 forgotten lives. Julian approached the counter, his heart pounding in his throat as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his Jaeger-LeCoultre watch. It was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, a self-winding timepiece with a dark alligator strap that he had purchased for $12,000 to celebrate his first major commercial contract in downtown Seattle. He placed it gently on the scratched glass display case, his fingers lingering on the cold steel casing. "I need to sell this," Julian said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The pawnbroker, an older man with a graying beard and a heavy loupe magnifying one eye, picked up the watch without a word. He turned it over, examining the movement, before letting out a soft, dismissive grunt. "No box, no papers," the man said, looking at Julian with a cold, practiced indifference. "Alligator strap is worn. I can give you $600 cash." Julian felt a hot flush of anger rise in his cheeks. $600. This is a $12,000 watch. It is in perfect working order. The pawnbroker set the watch back down on the glass, pushing it toward Julian. "Then take it back to Switzerland and sell it there, buddy. In this neighborhood, $600 is the best you are going to get. Take it or leave it." Julian stared at the watch, the last tangible symbol of his former wealth, his status, and his pride. He looked at his own reflection in the dusty glass, seeing a pale, disheveled man with dark circles under his hollow eyes and a week of uneven stubble on his jaw. He was a beggar now. He nodded slowly, his voice catching in his throat. "I will take it." He also reached up and slid his gold wedding band off his finger, placing it next to the watch. "How much for this?" The pawnbroker weighed the ring on a small digital scale. $50. Julian took the $650 in crumpled, greasy bills, stuffing them deep into his pocket, feeling a profound, sickening sense of self-loathing that seemed to coat his skin like grease. With $650 in cash, Julian set out to find shelter and employment. He spent the next 3 days walking through the industrial districts of Georgetown and Soto, where the towering cranes of the Seattle shipyards loomed over rows of brick warehouses and low-slung commercial offices. He targeted the smaller, less reputable drafting firms, the ones that operated out of rundown strip malls and did not require extensive background checks or corporate references. He went by his middle name, Arthur, presenting a heavily edited portfolio of his early residential designs, hoping to find a simple, anonymous drafting job that would pay him enough to survive. But the architectural community in the Pacific Northwest was a small, interconnected web, and his face had been plastered across the screens of every major firm in the city. At his fourth stop, a cramped engineering office smelling of stale coffee and ammonia, the hiring manager, a young man who had once applied for an internship at Vance and Associates, looked up from Julian's portfolio with a smirk of pure, malicious satisfaction. "You are Julian Vance," the man said, sliding the portfolio back across the desk. "The guy from the video. We do not have any openings for you here, Mr. Vance. Our clients expect a certain level of professional integrity." Julian snatched his portfolio and walked out, the young man's laughter echoing in his ears as the glass door swung shut behind him. By the end of the week, the reality of his complete professional blacklist had fully set in. No reputable firm would touch him, and even the shady, unpermitted contractors looked at him with suspicion. His cash was disappearing rapidly, spent on cheap bus passes and the lowest-tier motels he could find. Desperate to secure a semi-permanent roof over his head before the winter rains returned in earnest, he searched the classified ads on his burner phone, eventually finding a listing for a travel trailer parked in an industrial gravel lot near the Duwamish waterway. The landlord, a gruff, silent man named Miller who wore a grease-stained canvas jacket, did not ask for a credit check or a rental history. He merely looked at Julian's cash and pointed to a rusted, 24-foot travel trailer from the late 1970s parked in the corner of the lot, surrounded by stacks of shipping pallets and old tires. $300 a month, cash up front, Miller said, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the gravel. Utilities are hooked up to the main shop, but the heater is temperamental. Do not make any noise, and do not bring any trouble around here. Julian handed over $300, taking the small, brass key that felt cold and heavy in his palm. The trailer was a monument to decay. The interior smelled of damp wood, propane, and decades of stale tobacco. The laminate countertops were cracked and yellowed, and a thin layer of grime coated every surface. A narrow, sagging mattress sat in the rear of the cabin, beneath a small window that looked out onto the gray, oil-slicked waters of the canal. Julian sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, listening to the low, rhythmic rumble of the container terminals across the water and the steady, depressing drip of water from a small leak in the bathroom ceiling. This was his new home. The man who had once designed multi-million-dollar waterfront estates in Bellevue was now living in a rusted metal tube in the industrial heart of the city, hidden away like a piece of discarded machinery. To survive, Julian was forced to accept a humiliating, low-wage position with Miller, the landlord who also ran a small, unpermitted residential construction business. Miller paid him $15 an hour in cash to draft basic, illegal basement conversions and backyard accessory dwelling units for local slumlords. Julian sat at a battered wooden desk in the corner of Miller's drafty workshop, his fingers stiff from the cold as he drew crude, uninspired layouts on a cheap, outdated laptop. There was no artistry in his work, no vision, no passion. He was merely a machine, churning out functional, cramped designs that violated half the city's building codes, all while Miller watched him with a silent, watchful suspicion. Julian endured the humiliation in silence, his pride entirely crushed, his only goal to earn enough cash to buy groceries and keep the propane heater in his trailer running through the freezing nights. The true, crushing weight of his new reality arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 weeks after the night of the gala. Julian walked to the communal mailbox at the entrance of the gravel lot, his boots splashing through the muddy puddles. Among the junk mail and local flyers was a thick, official-looking envelope from the Department of the Treasury. He tore it open with trembling fingers, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes scanned the formal, cold language of the Internal Revenue Service. Because Eleanor had liquidated his partnership shares and sold their shared assets using his power of attorney, the transactions had been registered under his individual tax identification number. The letter informed him that he was personally liable for the capital gains and income taxes on those liquidations, totaling $350,422. The government was demanding immediate payment, warning him that failure to comply would result in the immediate garnishment of his wages, the seizure of any remaining personal property, and the placement of a permanent federal tax lien on his name. Julian leaned against the rusted chain-link fence of the gravel lot, the paper slipping from his hand as a wave of pure, suffocating panic washed over him. He had no assets, no savings, and his cash income from Miller was barely enough to keep him fed. He was financially enslaved for the rest of his life. Eleanor had not just taken his money, she had left him with a massive, insurmountable debt that would ensure he could never, ever rebuild his life. He was trapped in a financial grave of her design, and there was no legal escape. Desperate for some distraction, Julian walked to a small, greasy diner down the street to buy a cheap cup of black coffee. As he sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, his eyes drifted to a stack of local newspapers sitting at the end of the counter. On the cover of the local section of the Seattle Times, a large, vibrant photograph caught his eye. He froze, his heart stopping in his chest. The photograph showed Eleanor, radiant and elegant in a beautiful cream-colored wool coat, standing in front of a newly renovated, historic brick building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. She was smiling warmly, surrounded by local politicians and community leaders, holding a pair of giant ceremonial scissors. The headline above the photograph read, "A Sanctuary of Hope, Eleanor Vance opens new shelter for vulnerable women." Julian read the article with a rising, choking sense of fury. The piece praised Eleanor as a visionary philanthropist who had selflessly dedicated her personal fortune to establishing a state-of-the-art facility for victims of domestic abuse and emotional trauma. The article detailed how she had funded the entire project through her own foundation, using what she described as a creative and restorative reallocation of personal assets. There was no mention of Julian, no mention of the scandal, and no mention of the absolute, calculated ruin she had inflicted upon her husband to fund her saintly endeavor. The world was applauding her as a hero, a champion of the vulnerable, while Julian sat in a greasy diner in industrial squalor, facing a lifetime of debt and professional exile. The sheer, monstrous injustice of it felt like a physical blow to his chest, a suffocating weight that made it impossible to breathe. He had made a mistake, he had strayed, but she had destroyed his entire existence legally, financially, and socially, and the world was praising her for the execution. Julian stared at her smiling face on the newsprint, a quiet, dangerous rage beginning to take root in the empty, broken spaces of his soul. Chapter 6. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and inside the cramped, damp trailer on the outskirts of Seattle, the sound of the water drumming against the rusted aluminum roof had become a maddening, relentless static. 6 months had passed since the night of the architectural gala, 6 months of watching his life erode until there was nothing left but the raw, cold bones of survival. Julian Vance sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, his knees pulled toward his chest to preserve whatever warmth remained in his body. The small propane heater in the corner sputtered and hissed, emitting a faint, sickly sweet smell of gas that did not quite cover the odor of damp wood and old carpet. Outside the narrow, fogged window, the Duwamish waterway was a dark, churning ribbon of gray, carrying the debris of the industrial district out toward the Puget Sound. Julian stared at his hands, once clean and soft from a lifetime of drafting and luxury, now rough, calloused, and stained with the cheap ink of the basic drafting pens he was forced to use. He had spent the morning working at the battered wooden desk, his fingers stiff from the draft that whistled through the door frame. He was no longer an architect, he was a basic draftsman, a ghost writer of blueprints, earning $15 an hour in cash from Miller. His name was blacklisted from every major firm in the state of Washington, and his professional license was suspended pending the outcome of the civil investigation initiated by Clara Marshall's husband. The creative spark that had once defined him, the arrogance that had allowed him to stand before city boards and demand multi-million-dollar budgets, had been completely extinguished. Now, he drew simple, windowless basement conversions and illegal backyard cottages for landlords who did not care about aesthetics, only about cramming as many rent-paying tenants into as few square feet as possible. It was a cruel, poetic joke that the man who had once designed soaring glass towers was now spending his days drafting subterranean dungeons. A week ago, Julian had forced himself to make one final, desperate visit to the offices of Lawrence Croft, hoping against hope that some legal loophole had emerged to save him from the absolute ruin Eleanor had orchestrated. The memory of that meeting sat in his stomach like a cold stone. Croft had sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking at Julian with a mixture of professional pity and exhaustion. "There is nothing I can do for you, Julian," the lawyer had said, sliding a thick blue folder across the desk. "Your wife did not keep a single penny of the liquidated assets for herself. She did not buy a villa in Europe, and she did not deposit the money into a secret offshore account. Every dollar from your joint investments, the sale of your cars, and the rental income from your Bellevue home was transferred directly into the Eleanor Vance Sanctuary for Women. It is a fully registered, federally compliant nonprofit foundation. Because she did not personally profit from the transfers, and because the funds are now legally held by a charitable trust, the court cannot touch them. You cannot sue a registered charity for the recovery of personal assets when those assets were transferred using a valid, durable power of attorney that you signed voluntarily." Julian had leaned forward, his voice cracking with desperation. "But the tax liabilities, Lawrence. She sold the partnership shares under my name. The IRS is auditing me for $350,000 in unpaid capital gains. How can I be held responsible for taxes on money that was given to a charity?" Croft had sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Because the power of attorney authorized her to act in your name, Julian. Legally, those shares were sold by you, and the donation was made by her foundation. The tax write-off belongs to the charity, but the capital gains liability belongs to the individual whose name was on the shares. That is you. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your marital disputes. They see a massive, unpaid tax debt registered under your Social Security number. They have already placed a permanent lien on your name. Any bank account you open, any property you attempt to purchase, and any legitimate salary you earn will be immediately garnished until that debt is paid in full." But the final, most devastating blow had come when Julian asked about a divorce. He wanted to be free of her, to at least sever the legal tie that bound him to the woman who had destroyed him. Croft had shaken his head slowly. Eleanor has no intention of filing for divorce, Julian. And if you file, you will be responsible for her legal fees as well as your own, which you clearly cannot afford. More importantly, Washington is a no-fault state, but the court would look at your conduct, the public scandal, and the fact that you have no assets, and they would likely award her whatever remaining future earnings you might have as spousal support. She has left you in a legal limbo. You are married in name only, legally bound to a woman who is currently traveling the world on the dime of her charitable foundation, while you are trapped in a rusted trailer with a tax debt you can never pay. She has designed a perfect cage, Julian. If you try to break out, you will only cut yourself deeper. Julian had walked out of the office into the biting winter wind, the truth of his situation settling over him with a suffocating, absolute weight. He had returned to his trailer, and since that day, he had barely left the gravel lot, surviving on cheap canned soup and the few dollars Miller handed him at the end of each week. His world had shrunk to the four walls of the rusted metal tube, the sound of the rain, and the constant, gnawing presence of his own thoughts. He had tried to find comfort in his anger, to convince himself that Eleanor was the villain, a monster who had overstepped every boundary of decency and humanity to exact her revenge. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howled through the industrial lot and the trailer shook on its blocks, a small, persistent voice inside him whispered the truth. He had built this cage himself. He had handed her the tools when he dismissed her as weak, when he paraded his affair with Clara, and when he signed his name to those legal documents, believing she was too simple, too devoted, to ever use them against him. Desperate to escape the suffocating silence of the trailer, Julian stood up and pulled his hood over his head. He needed to walk, to feel some movement, even if it was only through the muddy gravel of the industrial yard. He walked down the highway, his head bowed against the stinging wind, until he reached the small, brightly lit convenience store at the corner of the intersection. The warmth of the store was a temporary relief, and he wandered the aisles aimlessly, pretending to shop just to delay his return to the cold trailer. As he approached the checkout counter to buy a cheap pack of cigarettes, his eyes caught the display of local magazines and newspapers. Sitting on the top rack was the latest issue of Seattle Metropolitan. The cover was a beautiful, high-gloss photograph of Eleanor. She was standing on a balcony overlooking the Swiss Alps, her hair styled perfectly, a look of serene, elegant confidence on her face. She wore a stunning cashmere coat, and her eyes, once filled with quiet devotion, now held a sharp, brilliant intelligence that Julian had never bothered to notice during their 15 years of marriage. The headline across the cover read, "Rebuilding Lives from the Ground Up, How Philanthropist Eleanor Vance Turned Personal Betrayal into a Global Mission of Healing." Julian stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the cover. He reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the magazine from the rack. He flipped the pages with frantic, shaking fingers until he found the feature article. The pages were filled with beautiful photographs of Eleanor traveling through Europe, speaking at international conferences in Geneva and London, and standing alongside world leaders who praised her foundation for its revolutionary approach to supporting victims of emotional abuse. The article described her as a heroic figure, a woman of immense strength and dignity who had faced a devastating public betrayal by her husband, the disgraced architect Julian Vance, and had used that pain to build a global network of sanctuaries for women. The writer of the article spoke of Julian with a casual, dismissive contempt, referring to him as a cautionary tale of arrogance and professional misconduct, a man who had lost everything because of his own greed and moral bankruptcy. The piece concluded with a quote from Eleanor herself, her words elegant, precise, and devastatingly cold. "True architecture is not about building glass towers to satisfy one's own ego, it is about creating safe spaces for those who have been broken by the selfishness of others. I do not harbor any anger toward my past. I simply took the ruins of my life and designed something beautiful from them." Julian let the magazine fall from his hands, the glossy pages fluttering shut on the dirty linoleum floor of the convenience store. A profound, suffocating sense of injustice rushed through his veins, hot and bitter as poison. He had made a mistake, yes. He had been unfaithful, he had been arrogant, and he had treated his marriage with a careless, selfish disregard. But the punishment did not fit the crime. Eleanor had not just left him, she had systematically erased his identity, stripped him of his career, his home, his money, and his family, and had left him to rot in a rusted trailer while she traveled the world as a celebrated saint. She had used his own name, his own signatures, and his own tax liabilities to fund her global rise to fame, leaving him with a lifetime of debt and a permanent public brand of shame. The world was applauding her, honoring her as a hero, while she lived in luxury off the very assets she had stolen from him under the guise of charity. The store clerk looked at him with a frown, pointing to the magazine on the floor. "You going to pay for that, buddy?" Julian did not answer. He turned on his heel and walked out of the store, the glass doors sliding shut behind him, cutting off the warm, bright light. He walked back into the cold, dark rain, his chest heaving with a silent, helpless rage. The wind howled down the highway, driving the freezing water against his face as he made his way back toward the industrial lot. He knew there was no escape. He would spend the rest of his days in that rusted trailer, drafting cheap basement apartments for $15 an hour, while the woman who had destroyed his life was celebrated by millions. He had played the game of betrayal with an amateur's arrogance, and he had been defeated by a master class in absolute, legal destruction. As he unlocked the door to his dark, freezing trailer, the last harsh laugh of his former life caught in his throat, replaced by the quiet, mocking drip of the water from the ceiling, a permanent reminder of the perfect prison he had helped his wife design.